The Beatles with their cover of Barrett Strong's Money, That's What I Want. You know, that song could work as a leitmotif for all the lawyers, accountants, con men, friends and foes behind the scenes who sued the Fab Four for various reasons over the years. And, of course, the boys themselves got in on the action and sued each other occasionally. Our guest today is Stan Soocher. He's an associate professor of music and entertainment industry studies at the University of Colorado's Denver campus. In addition, he's an entertainment attorney and has served as editor-in-chief of Entertainment Law and Finance. And he's the author of a new book called Baby You're a Rich Man, Suing the Beatles for Fun and Profit. Mr. Soocher will also be giving a presentation tomorrow at Fordham University. We'll talk about that in just a bit, but Stan, welcome to the show, and we have to start out by discussing why you chose to delve into this notorious legal morass.
Well, Ghosty, it's really, for one thing, as you're noting, it's a pretty fertile area of information and events, and there can be legal technicalities involved. Of course, there always are, but there are usually pretty good storylines, a lot of drama, a lot of tension. Two sides fighting it out. But in this case, with the Beatles, of course, and the interest, the Beatles fans out there wanting to know what really went on behind the scenes, that was a large part of the motivation for writing the book.
As the Beatles took off, there was an awful lot of money going around, and a lot of it never got to the Beatles. And as much as we respect what Brian Epstein was able to do for the group, He was brilliant in some ways and extremely naive in other ways.
Yeah, because, Brian Epstein, a major record retailer from the Liverpool area, from North England, that was really his thing, selling records. When he came upon the Beatles, discovered them, and started to groom them for stardom, he had to learn, let's say, from the ground up how to become a manager at a time when the industry was really not that sophisticated. Particularly, and in Baby You're a Rich Man, I go into the disputes that arose over the handling of the Beatles merchandise.
Right.
So that was really, it demonstrates quite a bit what a neophyte Brian Epstein was, and how the super success of the Beatles, as that surged forward like a tidal wave, really washed over Brian Epstein, and I would say just made it almost impossible for him to be as effective as he might have been if he was a much more seasoned manager with a band that was that successful. How knowledgeable were the Beatles themselves back then? Well, they were very young, very new to the industry. But I found amongst the documents I looked through an interesting quote from John Lennon, where he admitted, quote, "I don't go around reading record royalty statements. Somehow I'm given the money, and hopefully it ends up in my bank account." That was more of Lennon's attitude, and that was the kind of artist that Brian Epstein was dealing with early on. But the merchandising turned out to be quite a mess, because during the first 6 months of Beatlemania in the U.S., which of course began around February 1964, when the Beatles came here for their first appearance on Ed Sullivan, came to the U.S. for that, right around then, merchandising of all kinds is being sold, and it goes to a quick peak. I found amongst some of the documents a royalty statement from the licensor for the Beatles merchandise. And when I crunched the numbers, I came up with around $7,000 per Beatle that they got in royalties for the first 6 months of Beatlemania. It's an astounding story, because all the rest of the millions and millions of dollars, all the millions and millions of dollars, went to other parties.
Well, let's delve into that for just a moment, because $7,000 per Beatle doesn't sound like a lot of money when you factor in the Beatles flip your wig game and dolls and T-shirts and sweatshirts. You would think it would be an astronomical figure that the boys would have gotten. Explain why the Beatles and Brian Epstein got so little of that money.
Well, when the deal was first set up, when Brian Epstein first negotiated, he actually only asked for got 10%, right to 10% for the Beatles and himself, of the income that came in from the Beatles merchandise. Well, if we think about it, today an artist at the Beatles level would ask for as much as possible. Could they get 50%? Probably, maybe higher as well.
Right.
But the Beatles only had 10%. Split 5 ways. 4 Beatles and Brian Epstein. Plus, they had to pay taxes. Plus, they had to pay some expenses and other things. And Brian's commission as manager.
Hello. See these little fellas? They're the Beatles. Inflatable Beatles. They're yours, the 4 of them, for just $2 and 2 wrappers from Dove or Lux or Lifebuoy. So you'll find the Beatles at your supermarket in this display. Here's John, Ringo, George, and Paul. For full details, visit this display at your supermarket and have the Beatles, all 4 of them, for your very own.
You know, I hate to have this sound like we're bashing Brian here, because let's face it, he did so many wonderful things for the group. Without Brian Epstein, we wouldn't have heard of the Beatles.
Well, I mean, clearly as somebody to package them, we know the classic story, John Lennon rebelling at the thought of leaving the leather outfits and the tougher look that they had from Hamburg, Germany in their early years, and going into those outfits, the original, you might call the original boy band, were the Beatles. Same outfits, that's all Brian. But, John in the end got into one of those outfits too. So I would say that said a lot about the Beatles trusting Brian in terms of shaping their image to make them as successful as they were.
I want to move on to manager number 2 of the Beatles, or at least 3 of the Beatles, and that would be Alan Klein. Interestingly, there's a book out about his life right around the same time that your book has come out. And John, George, and Ringo choosing the somewhat shady and notoriously litigious Alan Klein as their manager turned out to be a disaster for the group in general, and one that stretched into the solo period of the Beatles.
Well, in that case, that went to the heart of the battle that went on amongst the Beatles, chiefly being the tension that went on between Paul McCartney on the one hand and the other 3 Beatles on the other hand, in terms of who should be managing the Beatles, what about their finances and things like that. McCartney wanted, of course, the classic story is he wanted his in-law, Lee Eastman, Linda McCartney's dad. Lee Eastman, a very well-known established attorney in music publishing and visual arts, were 2 of his big areas. And Lee's son, John Eastman, who was Linda's brother, who also a lawyer like Lee Eastman. So Paul wanted them. John Lennon, had a natural suspicion about, why should Paul's in-laws be looking out for all the rest of the Beatles' interests when really Paul is now tied with them as family. So the other 3 sought out somebody else, and it turned out it was Alan Klein. Alan Klein had been around himself quite a while in the industry, started as an industry accountant doing audits. Actually, he knew Don Kirshner, the impresario,
right,
in the music business, had actually suggested to Alan Klein, hey, why don't you start doing those kinds of things, music industry accounting. So Klein was known for his audits and things like that, but finally got to meet John Lennon and Yoko and came in knowing their music very well. That would be one big reason John Lennon really liked Alan Klein. Alan came in very knowledgeable about John and Yoko's music. Also, in addition to that, Alan had basically a childhood without 2 parents.
Right.
Alan Klein had been in an orphanage, so there was that tie as well. So there were a few things that drew John Lennon to Alan Klein, but also Ghosty. A key thing is this was quite an in-your-face to Paul McCartney and the Eastmans.
That's true, and eventually Paul sued John, George, and Ringo to break up the Beatles and also save the money because, look at what happened with the Rolling Stones. I mean, Alan Klein was their manager, and just to get rid of him because he was so much trouble, they just gave him all of their recordings up to 1971. Those records are still out on Abco Records. The Stones don't own those recording. So McCartney knew what was coming down. I mean, he at least had the wisdom to do something about it. I feel like Paul gets a bad rap here because he sued the other Beatles, but had he not done that, the situation would have been much worse. I mean, as it turns out, Paul was correct.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the irony is that, John, George, and Ringo entered into an agreement, a management agreement, with Alan Klein in 1969 in the spring. Paul did not sign off on that. But a few years after that, by 1973, John, George, and Ringo fired Alan Klein. They were tired of him. They were done with him. And, of course, Klein ends up in bitter lawsuits against those three Beatles, with Paul off to the side. So probably in the long run, you'd have to say Paul was right about that particular hitching up of the other three Beatles with Klein.
We're talking with Beatles author Stan Soocher today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. His new book is called Baby You're a Rich Man, Suing the Beatles for Fun and Profit. And he's going to be speaking at Fordham University School of Law tomorrow. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Another shady figure who factors into the Beatles story, and you devote a significant portion of your book to talking about him and his lawsuits, especially against John Lennon, and that would be Morris Levy. I thought it was interesting in your book, you mentioned that even as Morris Levy was suing John Lennon, John kind of liked him.
Well, and that's one of the wild stories, because of the differences in personalities, characters, and backgrounds of John Lennon and Morris Levy. Morris Levy went back quite a ways in the music industry, and he had his club in Manhattan, the famous jazz club, Birdland was his. He also owned Roulette Records, and many famous artists recorded on Roulette Records. But we know him nowadays mostly for his mob ties. He was considered to be a key frontman for the mob in the music business, but a very active one. So all that said, John Lennon said that one of the things he found out interesting about Morris Levy was that he was intriguing and was fascinating to John Lennon. I think that we could probably safely say that two things. It'll sound silly, but Morris Levy was probably not the walrus, nevertheless. And the other thing would be that Morris Levy had quite a bit of power in the industry. So one of the points of view on this whole thing about Morris Levy suing John Lennon over the song "Come Together," Morris Levy being the owner of an earlier Chuck Berry song named "You Can't Catch Me." Both songs had the line kind of like "Here Come a Flat Top"
right,
or "Here Come Old Flat Top," but that's just some flavoring of the story.
And the upshot of all this, as part of a settlement between Morris Levy and John Lennon, Lennon agrees to record several songs that Morris Levy owns the publishing of, and that becomes John Lennon's rock and roll album. But before that album can be released, Morris Levy takes the tapes and releases the album himself totally illegally and sells it on television as John Lennon's Roots album.
Now, Adam 8 presents one of the most incredible artists of our time, John Lennon, singing 15 of the great rock and roll hits, never before available anywhere. Yes, you get 15 great hits in one fabulous record album for just $4.98. Hear John Lennon sing "Ain't That a Shame." You get other fabulous songs like Peggy Sue, Bebopalula, Boney Maroney, Angel Baby, Ya Ya, Sweet Little 16, Rip It Up, and many more. Yes, John Lennon sings 15 great rock and roll hits, all in one fantastic album for just $4.98 or $5.98 for 8-track tape. Here's how to order.
Yeah, right. John Lennon winds up suing Morris Levy over that, and Lennon wins that lawsuit and still remains friends with Morris Levy. It's just madness. Our guest today is author Stan Soocher. His book is Baby You're a Rich Man, Suing the Beatles for Fun and Profit. Stan, one more case I'd like to discuss before we wrap up, and that's another plagiarism case, and probably the most famous one in all of rock and roll history. The George Harrison, My Sweet Lord / He's So Fine debacle. What can you tell us about that?
What was interesting about that one is the judge found that George did infringe on an earlier girl group hit called He's So Fine by the Chiffons, but that George did it subconsciously.
Right.
He didn't really intend to do it, but somehow the Chiffon song was in his mind. I think what's really most notable about the My Sweet Lord case is how long it lasted, Ghosty. George was sued by the publisher of the Chiffon song in 1971. The liability trial took place in 1976, and it was a trial at which George not only testified, He brought his guitar to the witness stand, and at one point in the trial, the judge, Judge Richard Owen, who was a composer himself of operas, and George were singing back and forth to each other, which raises that idea: who really was the fifth Beatle? Was it Richard Owen for that day? Some federal judge in a copyright infringement case? It's possible. But after George was found guilty of copyright infringement, but subconscious infringement, then Alan Klein, who was by then George's former manager, bought the right from the Chiffons music publisher to collect the damages from George and to collect increased damages. That's what Klein wanted. The battle between Klein and Harrison from that point forward went on until the end of the 1990s, a really long time to figure out who would get the right to what royalties coming in worldwide from My Sweet Lord and He's So Fine. So it's very notable for that reason. It shows a big hit record. There's a lot of litigation in the entertainment industry and the music business, but how an artist can get really impaled on it. In fact, Patty Boyd said that after George was sued over My Sweet Lord, he stopped listening to the radio. And George himself said it really hurt his ability to write songs.
Yeah, and it seems like Alan Klein was a guy you just didn't want to cross.
Or at least maybe not even cross the street with in some instances.
Yeah. Obviously, there's so much to talk about here, and we could spend hours talking about, this book factors in Morris Levy, Brian Epstein, the merchandising, also Nixon's Justice Department. I mean, it's almost like they were walking around with targets on their backs.
Yes, there are amazing amount of lawsuits and legal issues that came up related to the Beatles, and even since John Lennon died in 1980, if you move forward from there are a number of other cases. So they're always coming along, but somehow, Ghosty, somehow this really comes with fame. People become deep pocket defendants and big targets, as you noted. So that's where a lot of that comes from. It's almost inevitable if you reach that level of success. But in the Beatles case, it's Beatles cases, if I can say that. In the Beatles cases. So for Beatles fans, I think there's a lot to learn, not just about what their business and legal problems were, but there are a lot of insights in these cases into the music itself. The My Sweet Lord case that we're just talking about is a great example because George went deeply into talked about how he wrote his songs, who influenced him. All these things were part of the trial, and it's really fascinating Beatles music history.
Can you tell us a little bit about this presentation you're giving tomorrow at Fordham University School of Law?
Yeah. Well, this is a talk that's talking about the book. It'll be starts at noon at Fordham Law School in New York City, and just covering the books and the kinds of things we're talking about now, playing some music, showing some of the court documents, which are pretty interesting. Some, like the Beatles merchandise, one of the flyers I found from the authorized distributor to his salespeople in the U.S. had the slogan on it, "Ride the landslide." So I'll be showing things like that. It's kind of Beatles archival documents.
Very interesting. Where could people go to catch up with you online and get the book?
Sure. Right on Amazon. The book is available on Amazon. And you can learn about me by going to my website, which is Stan Soocher. That's StanSoocher.com.
I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Ghosty.